Hildryn has always been a good Warframe, but with the new update, she's become much stronger, dealing millions of damage, all while at the same time face-tanking Steel Path no problem. So, in this Warframe guide, I'm gonna tell you exactly how Hildryn works, what has changed in 2024, and most importantly, how you can get this massive performance right here for yourself. A big shout out to Warframe's Quest to Conquer Cancer initiative, donate for the good cause via the link in the description, and now with that being said, let's jump right into it. And as always, the first item on today's menu would be her ability, starting out with the passive, and when it comes to Hildryn, there is quite a lot going on in the passive department. Starting out with the fact that Hildryn does not have energy. Instead, Hildryn uses her massive shield pool to cast her skills, and whenever you pick up an energy orb, instead they refill 25 shield points. But that's not all. Hildryn shields also have another specialty, and that is, if you're in the purple overshield area, damage that would usually bypass shields, like for example Toxin, does no longer bypass her shields, so you could even go up against Infested and not die in 1 second. However though, due to the fact that we're actively using our shields to cast abilities, that means in practical gameplay we're not really gonna stay in the overshield area all that much, meaning this right here is not that consistent and I wouldn't totally rely on it. And finally, as if that's not enough, Hildryn also gets a massive 3.5 seconds of shield gating invulnerability at max. Ability number 1 is called Balefire. This is Hildryn's exalted secondary weapon, and it's sort of a wrist-mounted grenade launcher. You can fire it in 2 different ways, either with a quick shot or with a charge shot that deals more damage, and I think in order to understand it a bit better, how about we take a minute to look at the weapon's stats. Now, the first thing that we see here is that Balefire deals pure electricity damage and a darn lot of it. 500 for a quick shot and 1,500 for a charged one. That is nice, however unfortunately it also comes at a cost because we have an abysmal crit chance of just 5% with also a subpar multiplier of only 1.5x, and as if that's not enough, the status chance of just 10% is also nothing to write home about. All in all, what we're seeing here is a weapon that's meant to deal a lot of direct damage, but it's not meant to go into a lot of crit or status shenanigans. Balefire also has an augment called Balefire Surge, and this one in my opinion is not really worth it. What it does is fully charged shots now restore shields to Hildryn, and if you hit a nullifier shield, they will be instantly destroyed, recharging even more shields. Now, against Corpus, if those nullifiers really bother you, this might be worth going for, but in my personal opinion, there's not much need for this shield recharge through your first ability because we have other tools for that, and that's what we're going to take a look at next. That's right, because now we're going to talk about her second ability called Pillage. First off, what it does at base is it sends out an AoE energy wave for a couple of seconds that expands really rapidly, and all enemies hit by it will get their shields and armor reduced by a certain percentage. So we have a universal defense strip including shield and armor. In addition, once that expansion time frame is over, all the armor and shields that we've taken away will be added on top of Hildryn shields, giving you a massive shield regeneration, and at the same time, you and your allies, when they're hit by this wave, will get status cleanse on top. So, long story short, Pillage is the perfect all-in-one for Hildryn, giving you your shields back, therefore also kind of solving your energy economy at the same time, all while reducing enemy defenses. I mean, what more can you ask for? Just one thing to note here, in case you wanted to fully remove enemy defenses with just one cast of Pillage, that would require a total of 400% ability strength or 328% if you use the mod Corrosive Projection in your aura. This is quite a lot, but I would also recommend not even going for a full removal, and here is why. In order to even be able to restore your shields with Pillage, enemies need to have either armor or shields in the first place. If they don't have anything, you don't get shields back, meaning if you fully armor strip the entire room, then you won't have any source of shield regeneration for a while if you're in a pinch. Instead, rather go for a decent amount of ability strength that is enough to remove most of the enemy defenses, but not everything, so that the enemy damage resistance is still barely noticeable, but at the same time there would be enough armor in the room in case you need a second shield refill. Don't worry, I'm gonna explain exactly how this works in the build section later. There's also an augment called Blazing Pillage, but this one too, in my opinion, is not really worth the mod slot because all it does is add a bit of heat damage, and as you also saw in the intro, we have an exalted weapon dealing hundreds of thousands or even millions of damage, so why would we sacrifice a mod slot just to add a bit of damage to our armor strip? Ability number 3 is called Haven, and I'm gonna make this one a bit shorter because I think it's definitely the worst one in her arsenal, and we're gonna replace this one with something else from the helmet later on. Haven can link your shields to nearby allies and enemies. When you're linked to allies, they gain more maximum shields and a faster shield recharge rate, as well as also the 3.5 seconds of shield gating invulnerability like Hildryn herself as long as they're connected. If you play with a pre-made team and you want to help them out, this is definitely something to consider, and also in defense missions this does have a value because those buffs also apply to defense targets. However, on the other hand, it's not like this is a reinvention of the wheel or anything. Linking to your enemies doesn't even make this whole prospect any better because all it does is deal a bit of radiation damage, and as we also said with the Pillage augment, we have a weapon dealing bajillions of damage, so why do we need a bit of damage here? And finally, Hildryn's 4th ability is called Aegis Storm, and this one is again really interesting. What it does is it elevates you into the air, getting you in a sort of hover mode where you can fly around with WASD, ascend with spacebar, and go down with your crouch key. While in the air, you create an AoE around you where enemies that are in this AoE get also elevated into the air, stunned in the process, kind of a bit like the crowd control ability from Caliban. And while those enemies are in this lifted state, they create an energy orb every couple of seconds. This, on the one hand, is a great energy supply for your teammates on the ground, but also it's pretty good for you too, because picking up energy orbs restores your shields, and that also always works while your shields are being drained. This AoE field that you're creating gets bigger the closer you get to the ground, so for maximum impact, don't go all that high. And this is the big new upgrade for Hildryn, it also comes with a brand new augment called Aegis Gale. This augment is absolutely awesome, and in my opinion, it lifts Hildryn up by almost an entire tier. Remember your first ability, Hildryn's Exalted Wrist Cannons? These cannons are the only weapons that you can actually fire while hovering in Aegis Storm. And with Aegis Gale now, these Balefire cannons get a 3rd fire mode besides the charge and the quick shot, which is a burst fire, dealing not only more damage because it shoots more projectiles, but also it gets an additional damage bonus equal to 15% of Hildryn's maximum shields. So yeah, long story short, this one makes your weapons much more usable and convenient, all while at the same time giving you a massive damage boost. Definitely use this one. And before we go on to the build, it would be a massive help for the channel if you could maybe spare a like for the video, because that's what the YouTube algorithm loves. So cheers so much for your support, and now let's take a look at how we're gonna mod Mama Hildryn. So, let's talk about the build, but before we jump into the mods themselves, let me first take a second to explain what exactly this build is meant to do and how it's gonna function in practice. Today's build is not meant to play Hildryn into shield gating, but rather into shield tanking by stacking a lot of damage reduction, making you very survivable, and at the same time it's played in a way that you keep in the hovering mode as much as possible, raining down damage from above with your wrist-mounted Balefire cannons. To reduce enemy armor and to constantly refill your shields, we're going to use Pillage, and for today's build our 3rd ability is going to remain unused, and instead we're going to replace it with something from the helmet, about which we're going to talk here in a minute. But now that you know what this build is going to do, let's take a look at it, this time not starting out with the Archon shards like I usually do, but with the actual mod setup first. In the aura, we have multiple options. First off, if we want to keep it as tanky as possible, we would go for Aerodynamic, which gives you 24% damage reduction whenever you're in the air, which with this build is pretty much going to be all the time, so that is very nice. But if you think that little bit of tankiness is not that needed, we could also go for Corrosive Protection, which reduces all enemies' armor in the entire level by 18%, therefore giving them less damage reduction against our damage. And in case you have other suggestions what would be nice here, make sure to let us know in the comments down below. Next, in the Exla slot, it's a bit more straightforward with Aviator, because that is another mod giving you damage reduction when you're in the air, but this time not 24, but a massive 40%. Then, because Hildryn is a shield tank and also uses her shields to cast abilities, we want to make sure to have as many shields as possible naturally, therefore we go for Primed Redirection to expand our shield pool, and also a very niche mod called Boreal's Hatred that gives us even more shield capacity, as well as a little bit of ability efficiency, which will come in handy too, And because it's a set mod, it has a third little stat down here, which is very helpful for Hildryn in specific, because it gives us another 20% damage reduction. So much for our survivability. This is definitely going to keep us alive no problem in Steel Path. So let's now talk about our offensive capabilities, where we'll want to go for a decent chunk of ability strength, because naturally the more ability strength we have, the more defense script we're going to get from Pillage, and also the more damage we're going to deal with our Balefire cannons. So we go for Blind Rage, Umbral Intensify, as well as Mold Augmented. Next, we go for Aegis Gale, the Augment Mod for our 4th ability that massively increases the damage of our Balefire cannons, like I previously mentioned in the ability section. Arcane Avenger as crit buff for the Balefire cannons because they only have a crit chance of 5%, and with Arcane Avenger, we get that up to 50%, therefore enabling a crit playstyle on those non-crit weapons. That is definitely going to be a big boost in damage. And finally, for today's build, we're going to go for a lot of range, increasing the armor strip range, increasing the stun range from our 4th ability, and as we're going to see in a moment here, it's also essential for the helmet ability that we're going to put on Hildryn today. So we go for Overextended and Stretch, ending up with this total build right here. How about we take a look at the Archon shards next? For this Hildryn build, I went for 5 red ones, all into ability strength, ending us up at a total of 304% ability strength as soon as our Mold Augmented Arcane is fully maxed out. Remember what I said about Pillage in the ability section? You want to have a high ability strength, but not quite high enough to fully armor remove the enemies? Well, this is exactly what I've done here. Since I went with Corrosive Projection in the aura, I would need 328% to fully remove all enemy defenses in one cast, and with 304%, I'm close to it, but I still leave that little bit of headroom in order to be able to refuel my shields a second time. Now, you might argue you could also go into blue Archon shards to increase our maximum shields, because remember, the Augment Mod for our 4 increases our damage output by 15% based on our maximum shields. But I actually spent quite some bile resource to swap Archon shards back and forth to compare, and what I noticed is that ability strength actually increases the damage even further. Take a look at this. This right here is my bonus damage with 3 red shards for a total of plus 30% ability strength, compared to this here, which is instead going for 3 shards into shield capacity. So, long story short, rather go for ability strength because it not only benefits your damage more, but it also helps your pillage and the armor removal. But if you wanted to keep it a bit lower on the investment side, you can also totally get away with not using Archon shards at all. But now that we're already in the Helminth room, how about we now also talk about the Helminth ability that we're going to use, and for today's build, that would be Mag's Pull. See, first of all, I should maybe say that Hildryn, in my opinion, doesn't even quote-unquote need a Helminth ability. She is really good right off the bat, but in my opinion, her 3rd ability is a bit lackluster, so it gives you the perfect opportunity to fine-tune your playstyle with a Helminth option, which is exactly what I did today, because I just find it super cool to use Mag's Pull to pull all the enemies in the room right in front of my face and then blast them into pieces with the Balefire explosion. Especially in larger rooms where enemies are not closely grouped up by default, this is a massive help and super convenient, as you also see in all the gameplay footage in the background, and it's definitely the best grouping ability that you can put on Hildryn. But of course, you don't have to go with this. You could also play it super duper tanky with Mirage's Eclipse, giving you another layer of damage reduction and therefore basically making you completely unkillable. Roar or Zata's Whisper for more damage output. I've also seen Lavos' Val Rush being used to sort of turn you into a carpet bomber. I have yet to try that out myself, but it looked super duper fun. And I'm sure there are also even more viable options. By the way, if you tend to have a specific favorite, why don't you let us know in the comments down below. However, there is a last little chapter about this build, and that would be the secondary weapon, the Grimoire, as well as the Matarai Focus School. As I previously said, the more ability strength we have, the more damage we deal, and beyond just the figures that we can mod onto Hildryn herself, we can use the Grimoire weapon and the Matarai Focus School on top of that to even further upgrade our ability strength, and unlike in most other scenarios, this right here is even super convenient. See, when casting Aegis Storm, your hovering ability that with the augment also gives the damage boost to your Balefire cannons, the scaling of this ability will be based on your ability strength that you had the moment that you casted it. However, if the buff wears off after that, but the skill is still on, then it keeps on having the higher buff values even though the buff itself is already off. And given the fact that this build is meant to remain in the air pretty much the entire mission, that means in practice you only have to give yourself an ability strength buff one time, and the buff will be active for the rest of your airtime and won't have to be constantly refreshed, making it super duper convenient. So what does that mean for the Grimoire or the Madurai Focus School? Well, pretty simple. The Grimoire has a mod called Foam Invocation that gives you an ability strength buff up to 60% depending on how many enemies you hit with the alt fire of this, so that's an easy plus 60% strength. And if you wanted to go even further, there's a skill in the Madurai Focus School that gives you another ability strength buff if you Void Sling with your operator. So yeah, these two are definitely recommended to give you more ability strength and therefore massively increase your damage output for the entirety of the mission. Just one quick more thing, make sure to recast your Aegis Storm at least one time when you max out your Mold Augmented Arcane, just so that you can benefit from the entirety of your Mold Augmented stacks. Now, building Hildryn herself is all nice and well, but we also need to take a look at her Balefire cannons because those can be modded just like all the other exalted weapons too. So let's take a look at that. Now, the first thing, and that is very important with the Balefire cannons, is do not use Galvanized Shot. The damage bonus granted by Galvanized Shot's substat at the point of making this video does not work with the Balefire cannons. Yes, it should technically work, but these gun condition overload effects, like Galvanized Shot, like Galvanized Aptitude, and so on, they unfortunately always work very different on different weapons, and on some weapons they don't even work at all, so going for Galvanized Shot is going to be a complete waste. Instead, we're going to get our base damage from Hornet Strike as well as Magnum Force. Then we go for Multi-Shot with Galvanized Diffusion and Lethal Torrent, which has a nice side effect of giving us a little bit of fire rate, desperately needed with the Balefire cannons because they are atrociously slow. We go for Elemental Damage, whatever you need against the faction you're up against. In this example, we're going to go for Corrosive against GREAT with Prime Convulsion and Pathogen rounds. No 60/60s needed here because our base status chance is so low that we're not going to go for that and rather go for the maximum damage. A faction damage mod to amp up the damage even further, but if you wanted to, you could use something else in here. Since we're not going for damage over time, faction damage is not as needed here as with other builds. And then finally, we go for Prime Target Cracker to increase our crit damage, because remember, we have Arcane Avenger, therefore at least 50% crit chance, which as consequence makes going for more crit damage actually viable. This right here then would be my full Balefire cannon build against GREAT. However, there is another little element to this that comes from an external source, where we're going to go for either the Furex, the MK1 Furex, or the Furex Wraith. And the reason why we want to have one of these three specific melee weapons is because they can be equipped with the special mod Amalgam Furex Body Count, which has the nice side effect that pistol type weapons will get another little fire rate bonus. The Balefire cannons, as you remember, are pistol type weapons, therefore picking this melee with this specific mod will be very beneficial for our fire rate, and the rest of the melee build doesn't matter because we're not going to use the melee at all. So much for Hildryn and her weapons. However, especially with Hildryn, we do need to talk about companions because in comparison to other frames, for Hildryn, the choice of companion makes a noticeable impact in your damage output and your overall performance. So let's go over it. With Hildryn, in my opinion, you have three main options as a companion. Number one would be the Panzer Vulpaphyla, which is very cool because with it, you have an ally on the ground that viral primes the enemies for you, because as we all know, viral primed enemies take tons and tons more damage. Also, the Panzer is a companion that can easily go above 50% crit chance as well as above 1200 shields, making it very easy to get both the crit damage buff from Tenacious Bond for your Hildryn, as well as another 60% fire rate buff through Reinforced Bond. Next, we would have the Adarza Kavat, where the same thing is true for the crit as well as the shields, so also here you can go for Tenacious Bond, you can go for Reinforced Bond, but the special ability for the Adarza Kavat is the skill where it can give you another 60% flat crit chance increase, meaning if you're running Arcane Avenger giving you 45% flat crit chance, plus the 60% from the Adarza Kavat, that means you can get your weapon to over 100% crit chance, therefore getting a massive damage bonus. And finally, and this is also the option that I went for today, would be Diriga. Why Diriga? Well, let me explain. First of all, of course, we do have our coil. I've said it 100,000 times in other videos. You're probably sick of hearing it. Our coil is a really nice mod because it makes Diriga zap nearby enemies, and if you combine it with Manifold Bond, that means that all the elements on Diriga's weapon are going to be applied to the enemies that are being zapped. Therefore, this is a great status primer. So far, nothing new, nothing unexpected. But this is not the only reason why we're using Diriga. One special thing that you can do with Diriga, and also with all the other robotic companions, but I think Diriga is the best robotic companion for Hildryn, would be the skill Shield Charger. What this one does is, it increases your Warframe's maximum shield capacity. Remember, with the augment for Hildryn's 4th ability, we gain bonus damage on our weapon based on 15% of our maximum shield capacity. Meaning, under the influence of Shield Charger, when our maximum shield capacity is increased, we're gonna have a very noticeable damage increase. And that is something that the biological companions unfortunately don't have access to. But we're still not done yet. Next, we need to talk about Seismic Bond. Seismic Bond makes it that when a channeled ability is active, aka when we're in our hovering mode, damage dealt by our companion increases our ability efficiency by 3%, stacking to a maximum of 10 times, aka this can give you 30% ability efficiency. That right here is very nice and also very necessary because we're gonna spam abilities like crazy, and with the reduced efficiency from Blind Rage, this can get very costly on our shield capacity. Up next, and I'm sorry that this is dragging out so much, but there's another bond mod that comes in very handy here, and that would be Aerial Bond. And what it does is, it creates a cold field around you whenever you are in the air, aka all the time. So when we pull in enemies with Mag's Pull and they're very close to us, they're all going to be inflicted with cold from that cold field. Why is that important? Well, because enemies that are affected by cold take more crit damage, aka we again deal bigger numbers. And finally, of course, Tenacious Bond, because it is just a crazy OP crit damage buff and we absolutely shouldn't go without it. Only thing to note here though is that you need to equip your Sentinel with a weapon that can get to over 50% crit chance, otherwise this buff won't apply. Meaning you either go with the Volcax, the Volclock, the Primed Laser Rifle, or in the absolute ideal case, if you have a Riven, then you could also go with the Verglass Prime. I personally though went with the Primed Laser Rifle. This right here would be the build. It's not full and it doesn't have to be. The only important thing here is have one crit chance mod so you get over the 50%, therefore being able to get the buff from Tenacious Bond. And also very important, mod Viral and Heat onto it. This is gonna make it that whenever Diriga zaps enemies with this little electricity zap, all the elements that are on Diriga's weapon, aka this Primed Laser Rifle here, will also be applied to the enemy that Diriga hits with the zap. This way, if we mod Viral Heat onto the Primed Laser Rifle, this is amazing because Viral Primed enemies take much more damage, and Heat makes it that the enemy armor is melted down to half, which again massively increases our damage against them because less armor on their side means less damage reduction. Hildryn though is not the only Warframe who got a sizable buff. Also, Caliban is amazing now, so don't miss my Caliban guide right here. Another massive shout out to Quest to Conquer Cancer, link in the description. We see each other, hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.